When I read an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times entitled, "The Case for Restricting Hate Speech," I have to assume that I'm going to claw my eyes out of their sockets. So I read this article and I have to say that Laura Beth Nielsen, the author, writes an alluring piece that is just riddled with misleading statements. So I'll read them to you. I'll read each paragraph and try to analyze them as best I can. As a sociologist and legal scholar, I struggle to explain the boundaries of free speech to undergraduates. Despite the First Amendment, I tell my students, local, state, and federal laws limit all kinds of speech. We regulate advertising, obscenity, slander, libel, and citing lawless action to name just a few. My students nod along until we get to racist and sexist speech. Some can't grasp why, if we restrict so many forms of speech, we don't also restrict hate speech. Why, for example, did the Supreme Court on Monday rule that the Trademark Office cannot reject, quote, disparaging, end quote, applications like a request from an Oregon band to trademark, quote, the slants, end quote, as in Asian, quote, slant eyes, end quote. Okay, so let me work backwards from that. By trademarking the slants, the band does no physical harm, nor does it slander or libel a specific individual or group. And I know what you're thinking, oh, but it slanders Asians and Asian Americans, and that would be wrong, because slander by its very nature is defamatory by virtue of it being a false claim. Additionally, Asians and Asian Americans cannot speak on behalf of themselves because they're not a monolith. They're simply a demographic. So to address what you've identified as speech we already restrict, there is a qualification to that. We outlaw speech that threatens the physical well-being of an individual or group of individuals, and we don't restrict slander or libel. Those are issues carried out in civil court, and the individuals, group, or companies and or corporations who feel they've been slandered or libeled can choose to file lawsuits against those who committed said slander or libel. Now, I realize that's a semantic difference, but in defense of free speech, it's not exactly outright restriction of free speech. You see, you're being intentionally, intellectually dishonest by leaving out those distinctions, and I'm not even an attorney. Slander or libel would be me saying that the LA Times hates black people, and that's the reason why they don't hire them. That's not illegal for me to say, but if they so choose, they can file a lawsuit against me. But they can't press criminal charges. I can say death to Jews, and it's not illegal. Although I would imagine that the FBI might follow me around, but if I say I'm going to go out and kill a bunch of Jews today and I specify how and where, I can be charged with threatening an individual or a group of individuals. Again, this is simply intellectual dishonesty. The typical answer is that judges must balance benefits and harms. If judges are asked to compare the harm of restricting speech, a cherished core constitutional value, to the harm of hurt feelings, judges will rightly choose to protect free expression. But perhaps it's nonsense to characterize the nature of the harm as nothing more than an emotional scratch. That's a reflection of the deep inequalities in our society, and one that demonstrates a profound misunderstanding of how hate speech affects its targets. Okay, projection. If you say that it's perhaps nonsense to characterize the nature of the harm as nothing more than an emotional scratch which is a reflection of the deep inequalities in our society, then I say to you, how an individual or group reacts to words or speech is a direct reflection of the individual's or group's character. Social justice warriors will never be satisfied with the notion that they should, or better yet, have the ability to simply shrug off words or expressions. Because as you'll see, she doesn't offer a solution to this. All she says is that it's okay to be censorious to some things, but doesn't clarify what they are. However, it's easy to see that she's concerned with the left's marginalized groups, such as blacks and LGBT communities. Legally, we tell members of traditionally disadvantaged groups that they must live with hate speech except under very limited circumstances. The KKK can parade down Main Street. People can't falsely yell fire in a theater, but can yell the N-word at a person of color. College women are told that a crowd of frat boys chanting, "No means yes and yes means anal," is something they must tolerate in the name of someone else's freedom of speech. Okay, so let's work back from the beginning. First off, you can tell she's only concerned with marginalized groups, and I don't even think she can qualify who those groups are because none of the groups she just mentioned have a leader. They don't have a central figurehead or hold weekly or monthly meetings. I've lived in the United States my entire life, and I've never heard Black Meeting Thursday at 7 p.m. or all women report to the local JC's theater for your annual training in how to be a woman. Again, these people aren't a monolith. Secondly, who goes to KKK rallies? Why would you put yourself through that kind of self-flagellation? The KKK, it's such a fringe organization today. They're fucking irrelevant. No one cares about them. No one takes them seriously. And no shit you can't yell fire in a theater because that would be inciting mayhem or lawlessness. The mayhem would put people's physical safety in jeopardy. It's a safety issue. If someone yells the N-word at a black person or a bunch of frat guys yell, no means yes and yes means anal, do people really say that? But if they do that, what's the fucking sellout in just saying fuck off or ignoring it? Like, I'm genuinely asking. At the same time, our regime of free speech protects the powerful and popular. Many city governments, for instance, have banned panhandling at the behest of their business communities. The legal justification is that the targets of begging, commuters, tourists, and consumers, have important and legitimate purposes for being in public, get to work, or go shopping. The law therefore protects them from aggressive requests for money. Yeah. And what you're leaving out of this, too, is that they generally do it at traffic spots where it puts both the driver and the beggar in harm's way, or directly in front of businesses where they know people are going to spend money. But again, this is Ms. Nielsen being intellectually dishonest. This is a straw man. They're not protecting or restricting anyone's free speech. The beggars aren't being disadvantaged because they can't ask for money any more than the business owners are being empowered by their ability to censor the beggar. This is called solicitation. By these beggars being physically in front of the store, there's a reasonable belief that they'll drive away business just the same as if someone set up a widget stand outside a business. This is just clearly not an example of restricted speech. Consider also the protections afforded to soldiers' families in the case of Westboro Baptist anti-gay demonstrations. When the Supreme Court in 2011 upheld the church's right to stage offensive protests at veterans' funerals, Congress passed the Honoring America's Veterans Act, which prohibits any protests 300 to 500 feet around such funerals. The statute made no mention of protecting LGBTQ funeral attendees from hate speech, just soldiers' families. Okay, this is actually a point I agree on, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe there are some groups who are challenging this law. And it's one that I think is in direct contrast of the First Amendment. But I will say, I think if this law exists, it should exist for all funerals, not just soldiers' funerals. And I only say that because funerals are a really tragic and personal thing. The First Amendment has to protect bad taste and outright crudeness, no matter how unsavory or reprehensible we find it. Again, I'm against this law in principle. However, I am a human and completely empathize with the affected people, including the LGBTQ community. So soldiers, families, shoppers, and workers are protected from troubling speech. People of color, women walking down public streets, or just living in their dorm on a college campus are not. The only way to justify this disparity is to argue that commuters asked for money on the way to work experience tangible harm, while women catcalled and worse on the way to work do not, as if being the target of a request for change is worse than being racially disparaged by a stranger. See, now you're making this an emotional issue, and if that's your actual feeling on it, then you can fuck right off. As I explained, the issue with the shoppers and workers is not a free speech issue, and with the soldiers, it's simply an issue of poor taste. But the situation with people of color and women opens up the door to other issues. You see, you're opening the door to issues like those being faced by Dr. Jordan Peterson in Canada, where if he calls a person sir who is clearly a man but identifies as ? He faces potential legal charges. This is what you're fucking opening the door to. Because if someone doesn't like being called a kike, maybe the next guy doesn't like being called sir. Because while the former is a perfectly legitimate grievance and one I'd fight against, the other is clearly insane. The former is obviously a pejorative and one of the most disparaging racial epithets in existence, while the other is simply being polite. If you can restrict words, you can begin restricting ideas, and if you restrict ideas, then the next step is people will self-regulate their thoughts. Just take a second and think about what you're arguing for. In fact, empirical data suggest that frequent verbal harassment can lead to various negative consequences. Racist hate speech has been linked to cigarette smoking, high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and requires complex coping strategies. Exposure to racial slurs also diminishes academic performance. Women subjected to sexualized speech may develop a phenomenon of, quote, self-objectification, end quote, which is associated with eating disorders. You know, I'm not going to argue the statistics, but I'd simply say cite the source of these studies, because I'd like to read them. These negative physical and mental health outcomes, which embody the historical roots of race and gender oppression, mean that hate speech is not, quote, just speech, end quote. Hate speech is doing something. It results in tangible harms that are serious in and of themselves and that collectively amount to the harm of subordination, the harm of perpetuating discrimination, the harm of creating inequality. Listen, lady, nothing that I say, no matter how unsavory or distasteful, is oppressing you or restricting your rights. However, what you are proposing, giving these physically and mentally affected individuals peace of mind, might work, but it will do so at the expense of my rights, and not potentially. You would restrict my rights at the possibility that these people will feel better. Well, pardon my French, but fuck off. I don't care about their feelings. What are the mental faculties of these people you purport to care about? I'm sorry, but I'm not forgoing my freedom of speech, expression, and association at the possibility that someone might have peace of mind or won't kill themselves. Instead of characterizing racist and sexist hate speech as, quote, just speech, end quote, courts and legislatures need to account for this research and perhaps allow the restriction of hate speech as do all of the other economically advanced democracies of the world. Well, they did. And what's more, the vote by an ideological, divided Supreme Court said that my freedom to speak and associate freely is more important than your feelings. And they did so at the very slim margin of 8-0. They give fuck all about the research because they know no amount of research will account for the individual interpreting the speech. They won't risk someone else's freedom of expression at the chance that someone won't be affected. This is an incontrovertible consequence of freedom of speech. So you either restrict all speech or no speech at all, because once you start restricting some speech, you set a precedent which can restrict all speech. Many readers will find this line of thinking repellent. They will insist that protecting hate speech is consistent with and even central to our founding principles, because it is. They will argue that regulating hate speech would amount to a serious break from our tradition, which it would. They will trivialize the harms that social science research undeniably associates with being the target of hate speech and call people seeking recognition of these affronts snowflakes. That social science research undeniably associates. Interesting. Okay. First of all, you have to understand that social science is not exact science. Secondly, you need to listen close to what I'm about to tell you. You are assuming that because there's some kind of stigma attached to the millennial generation that all individuals think this way. I can tell you with complete confidence that not all of them do. You're concerned about a small percentage of American youth and an unknown percentage of American adults who think this is a problem, but you're failing to recognize that other people from those demographics don't. What you're lobbying for, what you are defending, is the tyranny of the minority. You are advocating reining in a new aristocracy. But these free speech absolutists must at least acknowledge two facts. First, the right to speak already is far from absolute. Well, no, it's actually the opposite of that. You can slander or libel, but you could face civil suits. And you can't threaten anyone or group or say something to incite lawlessness. That's almost completely unrestricted. Second, they're asking disadvantaged members of our society to shoulder a heavy burden with serious consequences. Bear the heavy load of what? Projection. They only bear this load if they allow it to affect them. Again, you're concerned about feelings and fairness, while I'm concerned with rights and justice. Because we are free to be hateful, members of traditionally marginalized groups suffer. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to listen well. What you are advocating is something that cannot be undone. Once this dam is opened, it can't be repaired. This would be an irreversible law. You are asking to set a precedent where a small group of individuals have the ability to determine what is acceptable and what is not. As I said earlier, if you regulate some speech, you open the door to regulate all speech, and it's only a matter of time before all speech will be regulated. Once you censor words, the next step is censoring beliefs, and once you censor beliefs, the final step is thought. This is not what we are founded on. These are not the tenets of liberalism. This is not the foundation of a free and open society. I've been waiting for a while to drop this quote because it's my favorite quote of all time. And if you ever think that it's okay to prevent someone from saying or believing something because it is oppressive to you, then remember that if you regulate what they can say and believe, then you are in fact the oppressor. Give me liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely, according to conscience, above all liberties. John Milton, 1644.